A good Erev Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. Great to be with you on a Friday afternoon. Shabbos will soon be here. Thank God. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we gather for an awesome page? We're really going to get an insight into kind of the life and community of the sages themselves as we learn about the laws of ostracism, right? When does somebody get booted from the community of the sages, under what circumstances, and for how long, will give us a lot of insight into what they were like and what it was like to live among them. Who's with us today? Pauline in Arkansas, Hannah in New York, Sharon in New Jersey, Patrice in Utah, Tom in Pennsylvania, Sharon in New Jersey, Patrice in New Jersey, Yehuda in South Carolina, John in Maine, Christo in Lubbock. Great being in Texas, great being home, right? James in Indianapolis, Annie in Michigan, Carolyn in Raleigh, Karen in Northern California, Mary in San Francisco, Barbara in Manchester, New Jersey, Gordo with us in Scotland. I love Fridays because Gordo can tune in. Jeannie, Mount Kisco, New York, Melissa in Great Neck, Bonnie in Texas, Elise in Niagara, Canada. A bunch of new names here. It's so great to have you with us. Thank you for tuning in. And over there on the YouTube side, Aoife in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily sponsored by Reb David Wolf. He's the dad of Rabbi Reuven Wolf. You might have caught Rabbi Wolf's appearance on my podcast, the AT podcast, discussing who is the Jewish Messiah and when will he come. That little podcast episode has had quite a life. It's on YouTube or on our website, just Rabbi Wolf at accidentaltalmudist.org. You'll find that podcast. And Reb David is Rabbi Reuven Wolf's dad. And he's sponsoring our show today in honor of Sal and Nina, and we honor you. You did a great job bringing up your son and all your family. We love you, Reb David. May you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen. Thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. All right, big page. So let's get into it. All right, we pick it up a few lines from the top on 16a here in Tractate Moed Katan, the 12th volume of the Talmud, the laws of Chol Moed, the intermediate days of the festivals. We are in chapter 3, still discussing the first Mishna of chapter 3, which is really all about the kinds of activities other than work that are going to be permitted or prohibited on the intermediate days of the festival. Shaving, laundering, haircuts. You should do those before the festival, not during the festival. But certain people who are precluded from doing it before the festival, like one who was in prison or was in captivity or was in a foreign land and only arrives, gets to a place where he can get a haircut, a shave, launder the clothes. For them, it's permitted to do it on the intermediate days. For the rest of us, no, we should have done that before the festival. So now that we've been talking about one who is ostracized, and what does that mean? For some reason, he kind of went up against the will of the sages, didn't accept a verdict, or insulted somebody, impugned the honor of a court or of a sage, and that could lead to a decree of ostracism. Usually that would last about a month, but very serious. The community would be well aware that this had happened, and we're going to get more into that discussion today. So, having discussed some of the restrictions applying to a person who was ostracized, that's where we finished yesterday. So Rava said, from where do we derive that a court agent is sent to summon the defendant to appear before the court before he is ostracized, right? So one situation where somebody's ostracized, there was a contract dispute. It was taken to a rabbinic court. They gave a ruling. And then the one who lost, it's like he didn't accept the binding arbitration, right? He didn't accept the authority of the court. He's not paying. So now the court needs to force him to pay, or the court has no teeth, right? So they might ostracize him, and that's going to have, real implications in the community. So Rava said, from where do we derive that the court now is sent to summon this person to let him know that he's been ostracized? We're taking your case up to the next level, as it were. So how do we know that we do this? That we send an agent to summon this person to court now that he's been ostracized or is going to be ostracized? So where do we know that? As it is written, Numbers 16:12, and Moses sent to call Datan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, right? So these were the guys who were part of this whole, uprising led by Korach against Moses in the wilderness. It's not going to go well for Korach and his followers. Likewise, Datan and Abiram. But before it went badly for them, like Moses gave them a chance to, back away from that challenge that they're issuing Moses, who's supported by God. Like, not so smart, right, to go up against Moses in the wilderness after he's, called the 10 plagues. He called that it would happen, and it happened. And, God told him, raise your arm, and the Red Sea parts, and now the manna is coming, and God having direct conversations with Moses. You're really going to challenge Moses when God is right there, pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night? Okay, but they did. So it is written, Moses sent to call Datan and Abiram, the sons of Eliab, right? So Moses didn't have to do that. He could have just, punish them. Ask God, take care of those guys. But Moses gave them every chance to walk back from their rebellion. And from where do we derive that we summon the defendant, that he himself must appear before the court? We don't just notify him that he's being ostracized. We tell him, come to court and receive your decree of ostracism, because maybe you'll, walk back and not have to be ostracized. You'll accept the authority. Or you accept the verdict, rather. As it is written, and Moses said to Korach, be you and all your congregation before the Lord, you and they, and Aaron tomorrow. So that was the episode with the fire pans, right? You bring your fire pans, we'll bring ours, and we'll see whom the Lord has selected to be the leaders of the Jewish people. Korach lost that battle, and then the ground's going to open up and swallow him. But Moses gave him every chance. From where is it derived that the defendant must be told that he is being summoned to appear before a great man? It's not just any court. This is why you should submit to the authority of this rabbinic court. As it is written, and Moses said to Korach, be you and all your congregation before the Lord. So in that case, the Lord was the judge. And from where is it derived that the summons must mention the names of both parties? You and so the plaintiff. As it is written, you and they and Aaron. And from where is it derived that we set a date for the court proceedings? As it is written in that same episode, tomorrow, right? You bring your fire pans and appear before the Lord alongside of me and Aaron tomorrow. That's the date for the trial. And from where is it derived that a second date must be set after the first date if the defendant did not heed the first summons. You might have thought that, well, we sent him the summons, he didn't come. Okay, so tough luck on him. We ostracize him. But no, you send a second summons. As it is written, Jeremiah 46:17, they did cry there. Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is but a noise. He has passed the time appointed. Surely as Tabor is among the mountains and Carmel by the sea, so shall he come. Although a time had been appointed and had passed, it was not canceled entirely, but pushed off to a later date. And from where do we derive that if the summoned person behaves disrespectfully toward the agent of the court, and the agent comes back and reports the conduct of the defendant, that this is not considered slander? Wait, slander? How did slander come into it? Because the agent is going to come to court and testify that I issued the summons and the guy told me to blow off, right? So he acted disrespectfully. It doesn't matter so much that he was mean to me, an agent of the court. What matters is that he blew me off. He told me to, F off. So what that means is he disrespected the authority of the court. And that's a crime, right? That's a real problem when somebody disrespects the court that way. Something that is going to be like a crime, a transgression, a trespass against the authority of a rabbinic court, normally we would not accept testimony about that except from two witnesses. And here the agent of the court is allowed to testify that, the court was disrespected because its agent was disrespected, and his testimony just from a single person is accepted only in that situation. Otherwise, an individual saying that somebody said such and such, that could be a slander, but this is not. As it is written, will you put out the eyes of these men? That's in the same episode of Dasan and Aviram and Korach, that Dasan and Aviram spoke these words to the messenger that Moses had sent to them, and the messenger reported it back to Moses. One witness, not two. From where do we derive that we ostracize one who does not obey a court summons? Right, that makes sense. As it is written, curse Meroz, who was ostracized for not coming to battle after having been summoned. Very interesting that they're going to derive this law that one who doesn't heed the summons of a court can thereby be punished by ostracism for not obeying the summons. Where are we learning that from? Not from what was that case of Moses, Aaron, Korach. I mean, that was really a trial before God. It had, many of the trappings of a trial. But this episode from Judges 5:23, this is actually the story of when Barak, the son of Avinoam, right, Ben Avinoam. I'm Yoel ben Avinoam. That's my Hebrew name. My dad is Avinoam. But Barak ben Avinoam goes to Deborah, who's judging Israel at that time, and says, we're being attacked. We're going to have a war with this guy Sisera. And I don't know that we can win it unless you come and participate and lead the troops, right? You, Deborah, bring your authority. And she said, well, I'll come, but you're making a mistake because you're going to get no recognition, no glory in the matter. It's all going to go to a woman. And she didn't mean herself. She was prophetically seeing how it would come out. Who's really remembered in that story? I mean, Deborah, yes, because then there's the song that is sung afterward in the book of Judges, but also Yael, right? So it's Yael, the woman who kills that general Sisera, the enemy general, by driving a wood stake through his head. At any rate, the people are having a war, right? Israel is going to have a war. And we need all hands on deck to participate in that war. Or, if we don't all unite and fight against the enemy, we're going to die. And so this guy Meroz didn't come. He just didn't think it was his battle. He wasn't going to participate. Whatever his reasons were, he didn't come. And so he was ostracized for not coming to battle after having been summoned by Deborah as a judge. And that's how it's related to a court case, since she was judging Israel at the time. Now, from where is it derived that the ostracized person must be told that it was the decision of a great man to ostracize him? As it is written, curse Meroz, said the messenger of the Lord, at Judges 5:23. And from where to derive that if he fails to mend his ways, we excommunicate such a person, right? That's the next step up. Excommunication, a much harsher decree from the court than ostracism. Ostracism temporary, excommunication can be permanent until it is rescinded. Nobody will do business. No one will talk to you. No one will, learn or teach Torah with you. It's a much more severe separation, as I mentioned a couple of times, like Spinoza in Amsterdam. And from where to derive that if he fails to mend his ways, then we excommunicate such a person more harshly, putting him under the most severe form of excommunication, as it is written, curse Meroz, curse bitterly its inhabitants. Judges 5:23, implying that one curse is followed by another, i.e. lesser ostracism is followed by harsh excommunication. From where is it derived that the curse applies to anyone who eats or drinks with or stands within 4 cubits of the ostracized person? Now you can see why ostracism is such a, strong measure. Like I said, they didn't have prisons, right? These rabbinic courts didn't have the option to jail somebody. They could shackle them. I don't know that they had a pillory, but they could flog someone. There was whipping, and they had a death penalty. So ostracism was that in-between thing that could really compel behavior as the court demands. And, this idea that you're going to be separated from the community, that has to have teeth, because what if the community says, well, the court said that, but this is my buddy, I'm going to keep talking with him. But if you keep talking with him, you can be ostracized also. As it is written, Judges 5:23, curse bitterly its inhabitants, in reference to all those sitting together with Meroz. And from where do we derive that we detail his sin in public? If somebody's going to be ostracized, the community has to know why this person is being ostracized. It's not kept private. As it is written, curse bitterly its inhabitants because they did not come to the help of the Lord when the nation was imperiled from Sisera. So Ulla said, Barak, the one who came to Deborah to ask for help, right? Barak ostracized Meroz with the blowing of 400 shofars due to his failure to come. As for the identification of Meroz, some say that he was a great man and that he was ostracized because he did not join in the war effort. And others say that the reference is to a star and not a human being, and that it did not aid the Jewish people in their battle. As it is stated, the stars fought from heaven. In their courses, they fought against Sisera, but this particular star, which did not help the Jewish people, was cursed. So this idea, who are the stars that are helping us or not helping us? Do the stars line up? What are we talking about? Well, when you say to somebody mazel tov, right, congratulating them on something good that has happened to them, they should enjoy their good fortune in this moment. We say congratulations. In Hebrew, mazel tov. Well, mazal tov means good stars, right? That's what it means. You have good stars, a good arrangement of the stars. And it's that idea, well, God doesn't need any intermediaries between the Holy One and us. We can talk to God anytime, personally. He's the strong silent type. He might not answer back in words, but God is always speaking to us in the language of events. But there's this understanding that God also uses, various channels in this world for God's, kind of energy and abundance to flow into the world. And the stars are kind of like a conduit. They're not any kind of, God forbid, deities or independent actors, as it were. But they're like channels, right? So I guess according to some views, Meroz was not a person, but it was like one channel, that kind of blocked God's goodness to the Jewish people, and so it was cursed. That's not the majority view. Okay. And from where do we derive that the court may declare the property of one who does not obey its orders as ownerless? Now, there's a strong enforcement mechanism that if you don't heed the demands of the court after it adjudicates a case and you don't accept the verdict, that it might declare your property ownerless. different like the American government, they seize your property if you commit certain crimes, and it becomes the property of the government. The rabbinic court says, no, your property is ownerless, and now anyone can come and claim it and just take your stuff. But that's certainly going to be a strong enforcement mechanism. And from where to derive that this is possible, or that a court does this, as it is written, Ezra 10:8, and that whoever would not come within 3 days, according to the council of the princes and the elders, all his substance shall be forfeited, Yaharam, and himself separated from the congregation of the exiles, shall be forfeited, is referring to excommunication and presumably the property made ownerless. And from where do we derive that we may contend with such a person and curse him and beat him and pull out his hair and make him take an oath in order to prevent him from sinning, as it is written, and I contended with them and cursed them and beat some of them and pulled out their hair and made them take an oath and made them take the oath by God. That's Nehemiah 13:25. So one kind of case that we've been talking about is like there was a financial dispute, a contract dispute between two parties. They came to the court, they received a ruling, one didn't accept. Something else is somebody who's just publicly flouting Torah laws, and in a community they might actually take action. It's not just that this guy is a bad Jew, as it were, and not following the mitzvahs, but he's like harming the community by flouting the laws and doing these public transgressions. And in some cases, they would compel that person to follow, the Torah laws. That's not something, obviously, that we do today. Maybe in some micro communities, certainly not in the greater Jewish community. But at the time, when we're talking about ancient Israel, which was, meant to be a community ruled by Torah law, right? And they might have even appointed a king at a certain point, Saul and David, Solomon, etc., who would sort of enforce the king's peace. But nevertheless, all the law is coming from the Torah. All the law is God's law. And so you might have to enforce people who are, sinning against God via an earthly court. And from where do we derive that we may shackle his hands? And that's what we saw yesterday, that if somebody was ostracized because of a financial thing, and then he happens to die while still ostracized, he gets a regular burial. But if he was ostracized because of his sin, right, and it probably has to be a high-level sin, a pretty serious sin for that to happen, then he does not get, an honorable burial, as it were. It's a big deal to die under such a decree of ostracism. And from where do we derive that we may shackle his hands and feet, chain him, and apply pressure, as it is written, whether it be for death or for banishment or for confiscation of goods or for imprisonment? So now there is imprisonment. Ezra 7:26. So that's early Second Temple period. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the word lishroshi, translated here as banishment? And Adamari said that Nehemiah bar Baruch said that Rav Chia bar Avin said that Rav Yehuda said this is pressure. Since this expression is also unclear, the Gemara asks, what is pressure? And Rav Yehuda, the son of Rav Shmuel bar Shelat, said in the name of Rav that this term refers to the following series of actions. They ostracize him immediately, and then again after 30 days. And if he still does not repent, they excommunicate him after 60 days. And Rav Huna bar Chanana said to him, Rav Chisda said as follows: before excommunicating a person, the court warns him 3 times, on Monday, Thursday, and the following Monday. The Gemara notes, this applies in a case where one ignores a monetary judgment that was issued against him. He is warned 3 times that he must repay his debt. But in a case where one behaves disrespectfully toward a Torah scholar, he is immediately ostracized. Ostracized, not excommunicated. So this we haven't really talked about in the same way. We said we would ostracize because the person sinned. We would ostracize because he didn't submit to the authority of the court. Now we're going to see that a person could be ostracized because he was insulting toward the sages. The Gemara relates that a certain butcher behaved disrespectfully toward Rav Tuvi bar Matana. And Abaye and Rava were appointed to the case, and they ostracized him. In the end, the butcher went and appeased his disputant, Rav Tuvi. And Abaye said, well, what should we do in this case? Right? The problem was that the butcher was insolent, disrespectful toward a sage, toward Rav Tuvi. So they ostracized him. Now, the other members of the community are not permitted to go buy meat from that butcher. Okay. But the guy backed off. He said, I did wrong. And he apologized to Rav Tuvi. So you would think, okay, well, now we rescind the decree of ostracism and we're back to business as usual. But there's a problem. His decree, shall he be released from his decree of ostracism? But his decree of ostracism has not yet been in effect for the usual 30 days. On the other hand, shall he not be released from ostracism? But the sages wish to enter his shop and purchase meat, and they are presently unable to do so. What then is the most appropriate course of action? For insulting a sage, you would normally receive a 30-day decree of ostracism. The guy backs off, he apologizes. They should rescind it, particularly because the sages themselves are being inconvenienced. They can't go to their usual butcher. So he said to Rav Idi bar Avin, have you heard anything with regard to such a case? And Rav Idi bar Avin said to Abaye, well, Rav Tachlifa bar Avimi said that Shmuel said as follows, a shofar blast at the time of ostracism makes it binding, and a shofar blast releases it. In other words, a shofar should be sounded now, as it had been sounded when the decree of ostracism was pronounced, and it should be canceled, even though 30 days have not passed. Abaye said to him, this applies in a case where one ignores a monetary judgment that was issued against him, and then he pays. Okay, so we rescind the decree. It doesn't matter how many days have passed. But in a case where one behaves disrespectfully, there must be no release until the decree of ostracism has been in effect for 30 days. The Gemara comments, apparently Abaye maintains that if 3 people ostracized one, 3 others may not come and release him. And this is derived from the fact that Abaye was concerned about releasing the butcher from ostracism and did not delegate the task to someone else. As a dilemma was raised before the sages, if 3 people ostracize someone, what is the law with regard to 3 others coming and releasing him from his decree of ostracism? The Gemara suggests, come and hear a proof from that which is taught in a Baraisa. One who is ostracized by the teacher of Torah for having acted disrespectfully toward him is considered ostracized with regard to the student. If you insult a Torah teacher, right, he won't talk to you, he's going to ostracize you, and his students will ostracize you. Makes sense? However, one who is ostracized by the student is not considered ostracized with regard to the teacher. The student, he's a Torah scholar, but he's a student, so it's lower degree. If he ostracizes you, that ruling doesn't necessarily also apply to the higher up, to his teacher. One who is ostracized by his own city is considered ostracized with regard to another city. However, one who was ostracized by another city is not considered ostracized with regard to his own city. Right? If the people of your own city ostracize you, then the surrounding cities will be like, well, this guy's a jerk. We don't want to have anything to do with him. Even in his own city, they ostracized him. If you get ostracized in some other city than where you live, well, then the people of your own city could say, who knows what happened in that other city? Who knows what their standards are? Who knows what's going on over there? We don't have to follow that decree here in your home city. One who was ostracized by the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, the head of the Sanhedrin, is considered ostracized with regard to all of the Jewish people. But one who is ostracized by all of the Jewish people is not considered ostracized with regard to the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. His authority is the highest. And unless he issues a ruling, no ruling applies to him. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, who was the Nasi, if one of the students sitting as a judge on the court had ostracized someone and he died before releasing him from the decree of ostracism, his portion of the decree of ostracism is not nullified. You would think the one who ostracized and then dies, that decree gets nullified, but no. And the Gemara says, learn 3 laws from this Baraisa. Learn from this, that in the case of a student who ostracizes someone due to an insult to his dignity, the dignity of the student, and not because the ostracized person was guilty of some transgression, his own sin, rather was disrespecting this student Torah scholar. Wait a minute, where am I? Not guilty of some, and he was not ostracized because he was guilty of some transgression, that the student's decree of ostracism is valid. Right? Again, because Torah scholars, it's not that they're petty people. It's that they are an officer of God, as it were. Right? So if you insult a Torah scholar, it's like you're leveling an insult at God and God's Torah. And that's why they're going to be very careful about their honor. And that's why if they ostracize you, that's going to stand up, even from a student, a Torah scholar. And were the case one where one was ostracized due to his own sin, everyone is required to respect the decree of ostracism, even the student's teacher. And learn from this that each and every one who participated in the decree of ostracism nullifies his own portion of the decree of ostracism, as the Baraisa speaks of his portion. And learn from this that if 3 people ostracized another person, 3 other people may not come and nullify the decree of ostracism. In other words, whoever issues that decree that that person is going to be ostracized, the one who issues the decree has to be the one who annuls or reverses the decree. Were it not the case, it wouldn't matter if a certain person's portion was not nullified, because his portion could be nullified by someone else. A Maimar said, the law is that if 3 people ostracize another person, 3 others may come and nullify the decree of ostracism. Rav Ashi said to a Maimar, but isn't it taught in a Baraisa? Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, if one of the students had ostracized another person and he died before releasing him from the decree of ostracism, his portion is not nullified. So how can somebody else come and nullify it? What is it? Not that it is not nullified at all, i.e. it cannot be nullified by another person. And the Gemara rejects this argument. No, this means that the decree of ostracism remains in force until 3 other people come and nullify it. I think that when we're talking about people here, we're talking about sages, right? Rabbis. So it's like a court of 3 can have its decree overruled by another court of 3, provided that that court was of equal stature or greater to the original court. The sages taught the following Baraisa. Ostracism does not apply for, and that is the law, by the way. I'll just read the halacha. If one was ostracized by a court of 3 people who have moved away, his decree of ostracism may be nullified by 3 other people on condition that he has abandoned his sin. And Rav Hai Gaon writes that those 3 must be of the same stature as the original 3 people, i.e. they must be as wise, as great, and of the same age. These requirements apply only if they perform the nullification within the initial period of ostracism. New subject. The sages taught the following Baraisa. Ostracism does not apply for less than a period of 30 days. And admonition, which is less severe than ostracism, does not apply for less than a period of 7 days. And although there is no proof with regard to the matter, i.e. the standard duration of admonition, there is an allusion to the matter, as it is stated, if her father had but spit in her face, should she not be ashamed for 7 days? And this was the episode where Moses' sister Miriam, went to their brother Aaron and said, what's up with Moses and what's going on with him and his wife, right? Basically, she was making a good point that because Moses had to be ready at any moment to receive prophecy from God, and when we were at Mount Sinai, God told Moses, tell all the people, don't come near a woman for 3 days, right? You can't have had marital relations for 3 days prior to an encounter with God, right? So that's fine for all the 2 million people in the encampment, but Moses himself who could be called to speak with God at any moment, he felt like he shouldn't, ever be with his wife. And Miriam, his sister, was critical of him for that because what are you doing? Like, she's your wife. She has wifely rights and privileges, and that you're ignoring. Just because you're the leader of the people and you're a big prophet doesn't mean you can ignore your wife. But speaking against Moses in the encampment of the Jewish people in the wilderness was never a good idea. And God took her statement as Lashon Hara. This is like the original source for the laws against Lashon Hara, speaking, using your tongue to slander and gossip about others. She was punished with tzara'as, right? So she became a metzora with the skin outbreak. And then Moses and Aaron prayed for her that she should be healed, and she was. The tsaros went away. So then, can she rejoin the people? And God said, hey, listen, if you just offend your own dad, you're going to have a period of 7 days, to think about that, where you're going to be separated. And she, offended Moses, the leader of the people, chosen by God. So she's going to need a 7-day timeout, as it were. And it's from that source that we have an illusion that, ostracism is 30 days. The next level down is admonition, and that's 7 days. Rav Chisda said, our decree of ostracism in Bavel, in the Jewish community in Babylonia, has the power of their admonition in Eretz Yisrael, in the Holy Land. Right? So this is the time we're talking about, the times of the Gemara, Jewish community in Babylonia. But there's many rabbis who are considered to have higher authority in Israel. Problem for them is they're under Roman rule. In Babylonia, they're under Persian rule, which was better for the Jews in this period. At any rate, so Rav Chisda is saying our decree of ostracism in Babylonia, right, which is like it should be that big 30-day thing, but no, ostracism in Babylonia is 7 days, like the admonition, the lower level punishment in Israel. Since the authorities in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, were ordained with the title rabbi, and the sages of the Gemara, we always call them Rav, not rabbi, right? Because they're understood, even though many of them were great scholars and, greater than anybody, Rabba, Abaye, Rava, etc., but they're not called rabbi, right? That was a title from the Mishna for the rabbis in Israel, even a little bit later than the Mishna, but for the rabbis in Israel. So since the authorities in Eretz Yisrael were ordained with the title rabbi, their admonition carries more weight than a decree of ostracism issued in Bavel. And the Gemara asks, is their admonition in Eretz Yisrael only 7 days and no more? But isn't it related that Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, right, the Nasi, head of the Sanhedrin, and Bar Kapara were sitting and studying, and they posed a difficulty with a certain halacha, a certain law. And Rabbi Shimon said to Bar Kapara, this issue requires my father, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, to explain it. And Bar Kapara said to Rabbi Shimon, somewhat mockingly, and what can your father, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, say about this issue? What's your dad going to add to this? Right? And Rabbi Shimon went and told his father, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, what Bar Kapara had said, and it doesn't sound so bad, but it was the tone, right? So he reported not just the words, but the tone. And Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi became angry with him. When Bar Kapara came at some later point to visit, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi said to him, Bar Kapara, I do not know you at all. Bar Kapara understood that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi had taken his statement to heart, i.e., was insulted, and he subsequently behaved as if he had been admonished as a self-imposed punishment for 30 days. And this is so colorful and interesting because, we might have been developing an idea in our mind that it's like, all right, the rabbis, the sages, they walk around in dignified robes like judges, and, the regular Joe Schmoes like us appear before them, for rulings and decrees, and if we misbehave, we get admonished or ostracized or, God forbid, excommunicated. And it's like they're righteous, saintly guys, and we're the riffraff who commit transgressions. But no, if you think about a lot of this, like what, for admonition or ostracism to really matter, the person who is admonished or ostracized has to buy into the system and care that he's being admonished or ostracized, right? If he doesn't buy into the whole system, then the court's not going to have that much teeth for him, as long as he doesn't mind being excluded from society. And if he doesn't mind, then, what are they going to do? But here what we're seeing is, these laws applied also, and maybe even more strongly, among the sages. And that when one of them was, because they argue pretty hard with each other, they're very passionate about their points of view. And although those discussions are understood, by us to model civility, the way that they would argue with each other and, of course, remain friends, and they were always coming from a place of, trying to understand and enforce God's will, occasionally the disputes were so passionate that they would end up being sarcastic or mocking or downright insulting to each other. And if they did that to somebody sort of higher up on the food chain of the sages, it could lead to this admonition, self-inflicted, right? Bar Kappara said something he shouldn't have said to Yehuda Hanasi. Yehuda Hanasi said, I don't know you at all. Bar Kappara could have just, walked away and said, oh, that didn't go well. I'm bummed. I need to apologize. But he said, oh, no. When the Nasi speaks to me like that, I've been admonished. I've been officially admonished. And I'm going to treat it like a self-imposed ostracism of 30 days, or at least a self-imposed punishment of 30 days. So the question that we're being asked is an admonishment 7 days or 30 days? So once again, on another occasion, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi decreed that students should not be taught in the marketplace, but only in a study hall. This is setting up the incident that's coming. Now, what verse did he expound to serve as the basis for this decree? The verse states, your rounded thighs are like jewels, the work of the hands of an artist. That's Shir Shirim, Song of Songs 7:2. Just as a thigh is ordinarily hidden and kept covered with clothes, so too the words of Torah, which are the work of the hands of an artist, i.e. God, must remain hidden in the study hall. We don't hold classes, sages teaching sages, or Torah, they're Talmudim, right? But teaching Torah, the sages teaching Torah to aspiring sages, right? We don't hold those classes in public, right? That's meant to be private. We're on the B side of 16 now. Despite Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's decree, Rabbi Chia went out and taught his two nephews, Rav and Rabba Bar Chana, in the marketplace. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi heard what he had done and became angry with him. When Rabbi Chia came at some later date to visit him, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi mockingly said to him, Iya, who is calling you outside? And by asking this question, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was intimating that Rabbi Chia should leave his house. And Rabbi Chia understood that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi had taken the matter to heart and was insulted. And so Rabbi Chia conducted himself as if he had been admonished officially and took on a self-imposed punishment for 30 days. There's so much good stuff here. I'm just going to read this because we read his name often, and it's good to hear a little bit of background on Rabbi Chia. So Rabbi Chia was the son of Abba from the Babylonian city of Kafri, and he was one of the last of the Tanaim, the rabbis of the Mishna. He was a contemporary of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Rabbi Chia was born to an important family that traced its roots to King David and included many important sages. Rabbi Chia was recognized as a leading Torah scholar even while living in Babylonia. As the Gemara attests, his efforts were credited by many with saving the Torah from oblivion. Upon moving to the land of Israel, Rabbi Chia became a close friend and colleague of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. He also became a close friend of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's son, Rabbi Shimon, with whom he became partners in the silk trade. A powerful force in his generation, he also worked closely with Rav, who was recognized as the leader of the Jewish people in Babylonia, but still learned from Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia's greatest work was the Tosefta, a collection of oral traditions that were not included in the Mishnah that was compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And this collection, which was assembled with the assistance of Rabbi Chia's disciple colleague, Rabbi Oshaya, was viewed as authoritative to the extent that the Talmud states that any baraisa that was not found in his work should not be discussed in the study hall. And some hold that Rabbi Chia edited the Tosefta that exists today. We normally think of the Tosefta as that very first layer of commentary on the Mishnah by the contemporaries of the Mishnah, but adding a little bit of commentary to it. And while it appears that Rabbi Chia was financially supported by others when he first came to Eretz Yisrael, ultimately he was a successful merchant who dealt in international business ventures and in particular the silk trade. And he had twin daughters, Pazi and Tavi, and twin sons, Yehuda and Chizkiah, who were leading sages in the generation between the Tanaim and the Amoraim, the rabbis of the Gemara. And his sons apparently took over his yeshiva in Tiberia, in Tiberias, after his passing. That's who Rabbi Chia is, who, unintentionally offended Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. When he realized what he'd done, he took on a self-imposed admonition punishment for 30 days. On the 30th day, so he kept a distance from the other sages. On the 30th day, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi sent him a message saying, "Come and visit me." However, he later reversed his opinion and sent him another message telling him not to come. And the Gemara asked, well, at the outset, what did he hold? And ultimately, what did he hold? Why did he change his mind? Why did Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi change his mind? So initially, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi held that the legal status of part of the day is like that of an entire day. Right? So the admonition would be for 30 days. So he says, okay, it's the 30th day, come and see me. But then he said, you know what? For this kind of issue, an admonition, a legal rebuke from a sage, it should be a 30 complete days. So don't come and see me until the end of the day. But ultimately, he held with regard to this issue, we do not say that the legal status of part of the day is like the whole day. In the end, Rabbi Chia came on the same day. He came like as if he was called the first time and ignored the second call to not come. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi asked him, why have you come? And Rabbi Chia responded, because you, master, sent me a message that I should come. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, but I sent you a second message that you should not come. And he responded, well, the messenger that you sent that told me to come, I saw him and I did what he said. But the messenger that said don't come, I didn't see him. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi read the verse about Rabbi Chia, Proverbs 16:7. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. In other words, God arranged for Rabbi Chia to get back and be with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi during that 30th day and, very friendly rapprochement. Concerning the issue with which the entire incident had begun, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi asked Rabbi Chia, what is the reason, right? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said, don't teach Torah to the students in the marketplace. Do it in the study hall. And Rabbi Chia taught his students in the marketplace where any passers-by could hear Torah being taught at a quite high level, right? Torah scholar to student Torah scholars. So what is the reason, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi asked, that the master acted as you did, ignoring my instructions to not teach Torah in the marketplace? Rabbi Chia said to him, as it is written, wisdom cries aloud in the streets, Proverbs 1:20, which implies that Torah should be publicized in the streets. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said to him, if you read this verse once, you certainly didn't read it a second time in greater depth. And if you read it a second time, you certainly didn't read it a third time. And if you read it a third time, then it was not adequately explained to you, as it is clear that you do not understand it properly. Nina and I have a principle in screenwriting that if you say something only once, you haven't said it at all, because people don't get it. They have to hear it more than once so that it sticks. And here Rebbe is saying to Rabbi Chia, if you read it once, you didn't read it twice. Meaning, if you read it once, like you haven't read it at all. You didn't grasp it. Wisdom cries aloud in the streets should be understood in accordance with the opinion of Rava. As Rava said, with regard to everyone who occupies himself with Torah study inside the privacy of his home, his Torah knowledge will proclaim his greatness outside, as it will be revealed to the masses and they will see his greatness. Meaning, if you study a lot of Torah and you act like a jerk, you miss the whole thing. Somebody who engages in a lot of Torah study, that Torah study's got to get inside that person and elevate that person and make that person a bigger mensch, a more decent, kind, compassionate, wise, respectable, and respecting person, so that you can see by his behavior that he's a Torah scholar. And that's what this verse from Proverbs means, wisdom cries aloud in the streets. The Gemara asks, but isn't it written, from the beginning I have not spoken in secret? That's Isaiah 48:16, implying that the Torah should be taught and proclaimed in public, says Sal on a live broadcast on Facebook and YouTube, quoting Isaiah. And the Gemara answers, that verse is referring to the days of the Kala, the gathering for Torah study held during Elul and Adar, when many people come to listen to Torah discourses. During this time, it is not only permitted, but even recommended to teach Torah to the masses. And in this way, the verse can be explained in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And the Gemara asks, and what did Rabbi Chia do with this verse? Your rounded thighs are like jewels, which Rebbe said, that means that we should do like the high-level Torah study private, not out in public. How did Rabbi Chia understand that? This verse implies that the Torah must be kept hidden in the study hall and not publicized in the marketplace. And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Chia, interprets it not as a reference to Torah, but referring to acts of charity and loving kindness, which should certainly be performed in private. Right? When you go out and be kind to people that are needy in one way or another, charity and loving kindness, do that privately. First of all, so you don't embarrass the one who receives the benefit of that, and also because you should be a modest person and do those kinds of mitzvahs privately. The incident demonstrates that apparently, admonition of those who live in Eretz Yisrael lasts for 30 days and not for 7 days. And the Gemara answers that this is not a conclusive proof, since Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was the Nasi. And the admonition of the Nasi of the Sanhedrin is different, i.e. more severe than the admonition of anyone else. Now, before we move on, is there a problem? Here we are sharing Torah, sharing the Talmud in this very public forum. Should this be kept private? What I would say, first of all, I've checked with rabbis about is it permitted to do what we're doing here? And yes, it is permitted. There are certain, lofty, more esoteric subjects that just would not be appropriate to share in a public forum. It should be done, one-on-one, face-to-face with the teacher. But this is a little bit more, general. It's obviously a very broad view of the tradition that we're taking when we're reading the entire Talmud, 1 page a day. Like, we're flying through the Talmud, right? When we, in yeshiva, you could easily spend a whole semester on 1 or 2 pages, certain key passages from the Talmud. So, what we're doing is that kind of broad overview, and there are certain, much deeper things. Kabbalah comes to mind, of course, but other kinds of, Merkava mysticism and all kinds of teachings that would not be appropriate in the public format. But this is okay. Okay, where are we? So the Gemara asks, and how long is our admonition in Bavel? And the Gemara answers, it is only 1 day, as in the case involving Shmuel and the exilarch Mar Ukva, when they would sit and study halacha, and Mar Ukva would sit before Shmuel at a distance of 4 cubits as a sign of respect. And Mar Ukva would conduct himself as though Shmuel were his teacher, because Shmuel was much greater than him in Torah matters. And when they would sit together in judgment, Shmuel would sit before Mar Ukva at a distance of 4 cubits, because Mar Ukva was the exilarch and the chief judge. But they would lower a place for Mar Ukva in the matting upon which he sat, and he would sit on it so that he could hear Shmuel's words of Torah even when they were engaged in judgment. A very nice working relationship between Mar Ukva, the exilarch, meaning the head of the Jewish community in Bavel, a political head who had access to the kings of Persia, because he, spoke on behalf of the Jewish people and the Jewish community, versus, quite learned in Torah, but not the biggest Torah sage. He was more the political power, and then Shmuel was the greatest sage, in that area. Every day, Mar Ukva would accompany Shmuel to his lodgings in the manner that a student would show honor toward his teacher. One day, Mar Ukva was so heavily preoccupied with a case that had been brought before him for judgment that he did not realize that Shmuel was walking behind him to show him respect due to his position as the exilarch. And exilarch, like patriarch, exilarch, right? But head of the community in exile. And when Mar Ukva reached his home, Shmuel said to him, "Is it not enough for you that I accompanied you until here? Release me, master, from my obligation so that I may return to my home." And Mar Ukva understood that Shmuel had taken the matter to heart and was insulted, and therefore he conducted himself as if he had been admonished for one day as a self-imposed punishment, not 7 days or 30 days like in Israel. And it was related that a certain woman was sitting alongside a path with her leg extended while she was sifting barley. And a Torah scholar passed by her on this path, but she did not yield to him and move her leg to make room for him. And he said, "How rude is that woman?" And the woman came before Rav Nachman to ask if this statement should be deemed in its excommunication. He said to her, "Did you hear the word excommunication explicitly issue from his mouth?" And she said to him, "No." And he said to her, "If this is the case, then go and observe an admonition for one day, as it appears that the Torah scholar sought only to admonish you, not ostracize you." Zutra bar Tuvia was once reading the portion of the Bible before Rav Yehuda. When he reached the verse, "Now these are the last words of David, King David." And Zutra bar Tuvia said to Rav Yehuda, "If it is written that these verses are the last of David's words, by inference, there are first words as well. If this is the case, what are these first words of David? Prior to this, it only mentions David's song, but not his words." And Rav Yehuda remained silent and said nothing to him. So Zutra bar Tuvia thought that Rav Yehuda did not hear what he had said. So he said to him a second time, "It is written here that these are the last of David's words, and by inference there must be first words as well. If this is the case, what are these first words of David?" And he said to him, Rav Yehuda said to him, "What do you think? Do you think that anyone who does not know the meaning of this verse is not a great man? Why are you stressing the fact that I do not know the answer to your question?" And Zutra bar Tuvia understood that Rav Yehuda had taken the matter to heart. Rav Yehuda was insulted by Zutra bar Tuvia's conduct. Therefore, he conducted himself as if he had been admonished for one day as a self-imposed punishment. So one day, an admonition lasts 1 day in Bavel, 7 days or more in Israel. The Gemara asks, but now that we've come to discuss this issue, the verse mentions David's last words. By inference, there are also first words. So what are these first words? And the Gemara answers, the first words are from 2 Shmuel 22:1, "And David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day that the Lord delivered him out of the hands of his enemies and out of the hand of Saul." This is a really long page. Both the A side and the B side are long. We're just not going to make it to the end of the page because I want to be able to take a few questions and comments. So I'm just going to do 4 short paragraphs and then take questions and comments. And if you're want to do the complete daf, then you're going to have about like a quarter page to do on your own. So the Gemara asks, so what were these first words of David? And the first were words, "And David spoke to the Lord the words of this song on the day that the Lord delivered him out of the hand of his enemies and out of the hands of Saul." And the Gemara elaborates, "The Holy One, blessed be he, said to David, 'David, do you recite a song over the fall of Saul?'" That sounds like a good title. "Had you been Saul and he were David, then I would have destroyed many Davids before him. Although I decreed that Saul's kingdom would not continue and that the crown and the scepter and the throne would pass from Saul to David, although God made that decree, it doesn't mean that Saul was not an important and prominent person to be respected. In fact, says the Gemara commentary from Rav Steinsaltz, although I decreed that Saul's kingdom would not continue, as an individual, he was far greater and more important than you. So you shouldn't be singing songs about his downfall, David." And in fact, you see later when Saul falls and David is pronounced king, but elsewhere in the land, Saul's son is also pronounced king. You don't usually hear about that. But then Saul's son, who was crowned king, not accepted by the whole kingdom, but was crowned king, and then was killed a short time later by a loyal follower of David, who then came to David and said, hey, he's dead. That son of Saul who was going to pretend to become king when you are the king, he's dead. You don't have to worry about anything. Life is good. And David had that guy killed, right? Because you don't kill a king of England, a king of Israel, even if it's to, accrue to David's merit, who has now been crowned the rightful king. Let me continue. Just almost finished. So God admonishes David for singing a song. And the response to this admonishment is found in the verse, as it is written, Psalm 7:1, Shigayon of David, which he sang to the Lord concerning the words of Cush the Benjamite. Is Cush his name? Saul is his name. Rather, this is the designation that indicates, just as a Cushite, a native of an ancient kingdom of Cush in eastern Africa, is distinguished by the color of his skin, so too Saul was distinguished by his actions, as he was absolutely righteous and performed many good deeds. Therefore, David uses the word Shigayon as an allusion to the error that he made when he sang a song of praise over Saul's downfall. And the Gemara notes, similarly, you can explain the verse, and Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses due to the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had taken a Cushite woman. His wife was not from Africa, his wife Zipporah, but is her name Cushite? Zipporah is her name. Rather, this example was used just as a Cushite is distinguished by the color of his skin, so too Zipporah was distinguished by her actions. And the Gemara continues, similarly, you can explain the verse. Now, when Ebed-Melech, the Cushite, heard, is his name Cushite? Zedekiah is his name, or Zedekiah is his name. Rather, just as the Cushite is distinguished by his skin, so too Zedekiah was distinguished by his righteous actions. And finally, similarly, you can explain the verse, are you not as much mine as the children of the Cushites, O children of Israel? Amos 9:7. Is their name Cushite? Israel is their name. And rather, just as Cushite stands out because of his skin, so too the Jewish people are distinguished by their actions, and they are different from all the other nations. Right? So it's very interesting if you think about the history of racism in the world. It's so profound. But here in this discussion in the Torah itself, what they're saying is that when somebody is alluded to, as being called a Cushite, which, we'd say, okay, well, that means like you're calling them somebody who has dark skin, somebody who's an African, and they're not an African. So what are you saying? And what they're simply saying is this one is distinguished. This is somebody who stands out, and stands out for positive deeds. In the case of Zipporah, in the case of the people of Israel, in the case of Saul, King Saul, he had problems with David, and David had problems with Saul, but Saul is still considered a righteous king, and we name children Saul or Shaul in Hebrew. Okay. Questions or comments? Tom, if a person... Wait, that's not the question. Tom, what is the word for ostracism as opposed to excommunication? Also, how does ostracism relate to the issue of agunah? So you're talking about the agunah issue. I assume you're talking about like a woman who's not being released from a marriage, right? In other words, in traditional Jewish law, only the husband can give a get, a bill of divorce to the wife. She can't give a get to the husband. So if the marriage is terrible, but the husband refuses to divorce the woman, she's trapped. Terrible situation. And that is a place, where ostracism is used even today, right? That the community pushes that person out and won't do business with him. Tom, the sages are deriving these laws late in the Second Temple period. Do they know if these were the actual practices centuries earlier? I mean, it seems to me like these are practices that were still in use. I mean, when we're talking, probably you asked this question before I read these later examples of sages that were insulted and then, issued an admonition or an ostracism, and that the others accepted that. So the practices were still in use. No doubt there was some, evolution in how things were done. And as we see, admonition and ostracism in Bavel, which is a later community than the community in Israel, took on a little bit different format than in Israel. Bill, perhaps it's best to say the stars and powers are independent actors only in the same sense that we are independent actors. We have free will and so do they, but our actions are still ordained in a transcendent way by God. We and the various spiritual powers are equally creatures from the old word for created, of the creator, creatures of the creator. And we may relate to them as kindred in that way, but we both may only relate to the one as creator. Right, and something that we see, not only here they were talking about the stars, a star, could Meroz refer to a star rather than a leader of one of the tribes or a general, as it were, a mayor of his community who didn't come to the aid of the nation when they were up against Sisera. But the other view that it refers to a star that didn't come to the aid of Israel like the rest of the stars did, whatever that means. But we see elsewhere in the Talmud, especially right in the Gemara, as opposed to the Babylonian Talmud as opposed to the Jerusalem Talmud, a lot of discussions of demons and angels, right? So these other spiritual entities, what they mean, what does it mean that they exist in this world? But we're all creatures of the same creator, and this point of, well, if God has ordained the whole history of the world, the whole history of the creation, what does it mean that we have free will? And we learn in many places, but particularly from Rabbi Akiva, that this is the paradox that humans can't understand, but which nevertheless is so. God knows what's going to happen, and we have free will. Tough to understand, but that's the way it is. Caroline, last question, because I know this class has run really long. So do you think that teaching was in private as a reflection of the appropriate level of reverence to the subject matter, or perhaps an homage to the hidden essence of God in this world? And then again, of course, back then, women would not have been able to study too. In a way, was that not a form of ostracism for them? Is not separation from studying the Word of God not considered an excommunication in one of the highest senses? So, you've said a lot there at the end of a long class. So let's try. Okay. First of all, there are certain topics that are definitely more esoteric topics that just don't make sense to put out there in public, right? So various kinds of mysticism would not make sense for that. But what about just, kind of like more straightforward understanding of Torah and what's demanded of us? I mean, they were having these big sort of like Torah conventions a couple times a year in Elul and Adar, and then the whole public was coming to hear Torah lectures all day long. But I think what they're saying is, so that's Torah made accessible to the masses, as it were, like hopefully what we're doing here. Whereas, just like, in college, you could take a beginner, an introductory course, intermediate course, advanced course, super advanced course. There's just different levels that are going to make sense. And I think those higher level courses are what they felt should be taught in more private settings, because people that don't have the background to understand what's really being said there might come and hear sages, discussing idolatry, because they have to learn it and understand how to deal with it, because they might have to judge cases where somebody's being accused of idolatry. But the uninitiated might come and hear that class being taught and only catch a few words and say, oh my God, these people are star worshipers. The sages are idolaters. Unless people make that kind of a mistake, they felt that should be taught in private. And that made more sense. About women being left out, this was a patriarchal system, and that was a huge problem. And yet, even in the Talmud, we see that there are a bunch of women who are, like Beruri as a big example, and even the maidservants in Rebbe's home in his residence were understood to be women of great wisdom, and then we listen to them when they report a Torah matter. So there were already women even back then, and the idea that women weren't obligated in Torah study because they're going to be the primary caregivers of the children, and so they can't be obligated in time-bound positive commandments like studying Torah every day. Wasn't because they were looked down on as incapable of learning. It's just that they were splitting responsibilities. Nevertheless, thank God we live in a time where, Torah is much more accessible to everybody, and I love our community here and how we all learn together. That's what I've got today. My friends, you should be blessed with such a sweet Shabbos. May God's goodness just flow into your home tonight, and you really feel the peace of Shabbos enter your life as the sun sets tonight. Good Shabbos.